Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, Tree Planting and Care During COVID. I am Mariela Racho from California Relief, and I'll be your host. As everyone is logging in, please take time. I have a polling question, so I'm going to launch it right now. Take time to answer the polling question. It's very quick. Have you been able to host a tree planting event since COVID started? It's just yes or no. And we basically just want to get a baseline on how active your organization has been during COVID. So yeah. And then while you're answering the polling question, please let us know on the chat where you're logging in from and if you can hear us. I know there were some people from Texas who registered and other parts of the US. Ooh, Portland. Coachella Valley, Davis. Ooh, close to Sacramento. Yay, Davis. Redwood City, San Jose, San Francisco. Okay, I'm gonna close the polling questions and share with everyone. So yes is 26%. So bravo to people who were able to host tree planting events, and then 74 said no. So we're gonna go over like some of the challenges you might have. Okay, so now I want to launch a second polling question. Again, want to see the baseline for everyone. Launch. And then the question is, if you have not hosted a tree planting or care event, why not? I would really want to know like some of the reasons why you weren't able to host the events. Some of the answers are my county had a stay-at-home order, workers and volunteers felt uncomfortable attending events, no capacity due to being a volunteer-based organization, unable to fund tree planting events due to COVID. And if there's any other reason that I did not list out, please let us know in the chat, like what other reasons were made it possible so that you were unable to host events. You can include staff planning. Let's see. Liability issues. I know someone listed liability issues. Okay, I'm gonna share close it and share the results. So 78% said it was due to county had a stay-at-home order. 42 said workers and volunteers felt uncomfortable. And then 25% said no capacity due to being a volunteer-based organization. And then other reasons that I see in the question or chat area, it says liability concerns. So they didn't host anything. Let's see. Other reasons, we work with high school students and our program paused over the summer. So working with schools, so you weren't able to plant. Okay, let me close the questions. Okay, so now we're at the PowerPoint. So I just want to say again, hi everyone, my name is Mariela Racho from California Relief, and I will be your host for today. Thank you everyone for taking the time to attend our tree planting and care during COVID webinar. We know some of you are planning to do tree planting events for the fall, so we saw a need to get these speakers together to discuss PPE, resources, and provide examples of how some organizations are adapting to COVID and how some other organizations are continuing to engage and educate people about their urban forest even though there is a stay-at-home order. Also, we are going to start with at the statewide level with CAL FIRE, who will be talking about the Urban and Community Forestry Program. And then we're going to go to California Reliefs, so our grant director and our executive director. And then we're going to move to the local level with Rachel Mallarich, Mona Cummings, and Elise Willis. All of them from different parts of the states. Rachel from Los Angeles, Mona from Fresno, and Elise from the San Jose area. Just to go over some logistics, Cindy, can you move to the second slide? Yeah, so as you can see, our agenda is packed. So we are going to be also hosting a Zoom meeting on Friday, September 18 at 11. This will be for a peer-to-peer guidance to talk about the challenges organizations are facing and all of that stuff. And then you can find the registration link. I'll put it in the chat in a moment. Please type out questions that you have under the questions section and then we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You can find the links we are going to talk about during I'm sorry. You can find the links we are going to talk about and resources we will cover on our COVID page. And you can also find the registration link for the webinar. Lastly, the webinar will be recorded and you will receive a link to rewatch the webinar. So now I'm gonna kick it off to CAL FIRE, both Henry, to Henry and Julia. So next slide.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Julia Gowan. I'm the Regional Urban Forester for Northern California Inland for CAL FIRE, and I'm based out of Sacramento. And one of my counterparts from the South is also on the call. Henry, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Henry Herrera. I'm the Regional Urban Forester for Los Angeles and Ventura counties. Welcome, and thank you for being here today.
We are a total of 6 CAL FIRE regional urban foresters across the state, and we really are here to assist as technical experts and advocates for your projects, as well as administer our urban and community forestry grants. If you have an urban and community forestry grant, I really recommend being in contact with your grant agency throughout the project, whether it's CAL FIRE, Relief, or another agency, but especially if you are experiencing issues, and that could be related to COVID or otherwise. But if you're in contact early on, your contact person can really help you much better to straighten out issues that you might face. And Henry will talk more about project changes and COVID-related expenses in a little bit. And if you don't have a grant, but are thinking about applying for one in the future, you're welcome to reach out to the regional urban forester in your region for information about our program and deadlines and all that stuff. We usually have funding every year, usually. Cindy, could you go forward one slide? Just as an information how to find us, you can either Google CAL FIRE Urban and Community Forestry, or you can find the URL somewhere. But if you're on our website, in the middle to the left highlighted is a link to program staff, and that's where all the regional urban foresters are. And then on the right-hand side, there's a link to the Urban and Community Forestry Grants Program. And through that, you can see updates and documents that are needed, deadlines, anything related to our grant program. Cindy, could you go back, please? Oh, no, back, actually, sorry. So as I mentioned, we usually have funds every year, and applications are usually due in November. That being said, we know that we will have some funding available for our next grant cycle, but we don't really know how much and when and what it is used for. So we know it won't be as much as in recent years, but we don't quite know how much. So stay tuned for more information on that. You can reach out to the regional urban foresters for more information, but at this point, we actually don't have that information either. It's beyond our authority, but hopefully we'll know more soon. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Henry.
Thank you, Julia. The next item there is extensions. We're in the process of seeking extensions for the current grants that we are administering for the year 17 and 18 and 18 and 19 grants. Last year, if you were a grantee that had a grant for the year 2016, we were able to extend that 1 year through March 30th of 2021. So we won't be able to extend those anymore, but due to COVID, and we are looking into whether we can extend the 17 and 18 grants. That's not for sure yet, but once we do have a definite answer, we'll let all of our grantees know. In the event that they are interested in extending their grants, then we'll amend their grants for another year. So stay tuned on that. Due to COVID, we are aware that there have been many changes that you've had to do to accommodate the requirements and the guidelines that are currently in place through your organization, the county, the city, the state, in order to reduce the risk, the spread of the virus. And as a result, you've incurred additional, you may have incurred additional expenses in order to be able to provide personal protective equipment, such as sanitizers or masks, or the need to make modifications around your work site, and purchase signage or install plexiglass. You know, we're all teleworking nowadays a lot more than we probably ever have, and so there's also some expenses in relation to Zoom subscriptions or some sort of other webinar company or program that's out there. The need to purchase thermometers to take temperatures, things like that. What you see on the screen is just a list of some of the items that you can work with your agency, whether it's Relief or CAL FIRE, to make modifications to your budget and cover those expenses. That this is not a complete list. So if you do have other expenses or other purchases that you need to make that you would like to cover using your grant funds that were not originally included in your budget, and you have funds within your budget from an existing line item where you could shift some funds over to a new line item to cover COVID-related expenses, then contact your grant administrator, whether that's your local regional CAL FIRE urban forester, or whether it's one of the Relief staff members that's administering your grant, so that you guys can discuss how to move forward to do that, and whether a certain expense is covered by the grant or not. Before you do incur expenses, make sure you submit your request to modify or amend your grant or your existing budget to cover those expenses. Make sure it's approved prior to incurring those expenses, so that you are aware whether or not it's an expense that can be covered. We can make those changes depending on what it is and the amount of money that needs to be shifted from your existing budget to cover that through either an amendment or modification. One thing to keep in mind is that the project scope does have to remain the same. So if you said you're going to plant 500 trees and create 200 tree wells, we still expect you to meet those requirements. And so you'll need to identify where you can afford to move some funds from an existing line item in order to cover the COVID-related expenses. As always, we cannot increase your grant award, so you have to work within your budget. Events during COVID, your grant is funded using state funds, which means that we work directly under the ultimately under the governor, Governor Newsom, and so we do have to abide by all of the state requirements in relation to COVID-19. There are no exceptions, so we do expect everybody to follow those guidelines when implementing your project, conducting volunteer events, etc., to reduce the spread. I believe that's everything that I have. We are here for you. We know these are difficult and challenging times, and there are a lot of things that are coming up that we didn't cover in our grant guidelines just because this was something that was unprecedented. But we're here for you, and we're here to provide technical support, advice, advocate for your project. Any questions related to current grants, upcoming funding opportunities, extensions, application periods, we're more than happy to answer those questions for you. So please don't hesitate to contact your urban forester or your grant administrator through Relief or CAL FIRE. We want to make sure you're successful in your project, and we're willing to work with you as much as possible. I want to thank you on behalf of our department for doing what you're doing. We know that you're doing a lot of work, and you've been very creative, and you've been able to find ways to still get the job done. So we really appreciate it. We know it's not easy. So thank you for all your work. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Chuck Mills with Relief Director of Public Policy and Grants. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Henry and Julia. That was really informative. And I'd like to just make a quick unsolicited plug to reinforce what Henry was saying regarding connecting with your regional urban foresters. This is a great group of people that have direct on-the-ground experience. They're a little different from a lot of other state agencies in that they're our field area, they are field operatives in the geography that you serve. And so they have a lot of experience and knowledge about the areas and are there as a great resource. So really appreciate your time, Julia and Henry, and can only reinforce what they're talking about reaching out to your regional urban forester. So in a couple of minutes that I have, I'm going to actually reinforce a couple of things that Henry said. As he mentioned, we are in a period of uncertainty in terms of where the state is heading, but there are some rules that we need to abide by to keep everyone safe, and that's going to be the focal point of my discussion. But before we get too deep into that, I'll do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Chuck Mills. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Grants at California Relief. I work on advocacy and public policy issues, primarily at the state level in conjunction with my colleague Mariela, and then we also administer a grant program. We're actually administering 3 grant programs right now and a 4th coming online soon that we'll talk more about. And I do that in conjunction with my colleague Amelia Oliver. Before we start going to the next slide though, it's time for another poll question. So Mariela, if you can bring that up, I'll read it to everyone. Have you had any challenges getting people to wear a mask and or practice social distancing during the tree planting care events that you've been able to perform over the last 6 months? So quick yes or no question. We'll leave this open for about 30 seconds and then close out and show the results. In the meantime, I'll reinforce what Mariela was saying. If you have questions, please do list them in the question area. We'll be I believe Mariela is monitoring that, and then I'll be monitoring the chat to see if anything comes up in there as well after I'm done with this part of the presentation. So we'll give this a few more seconds. Okay, Marielle, if you want to start closing it out, hopefully that gave everyone an opportunity. Wow, all right. So that's good to hear that there's only been some challenges. Majority of people have not encountered any challenges. That's really good. So thank you for sharing that with us. That's going to help us in determining future webinars and information disseminated. So I think with that, we can go to the next slide. So reinforcing what Henry said, this applies not only, of course, to the CAL FIRE grants, but California Relief grants as well, is that, yes, obviously there's new tools for the shed, tools that we hadn't necessarily anticipated a year ago, but are completely appropriate given the time that we're in California. So obviously a lot of the same things that Henry highlighted in his presentation. One thing that I did neglect to put here, but is completely appropriate even with our grants, is the Zoom subscription. Obviously, that's a new norm for communication, and we completely understand that that may be a mechanism necessary to perform your education component of your grant, whether it's with us or CAL FIRE. So all these pieces really are encouraged, and again, reinforcing what Henry said is, unfortunately, at this point, they do need to stay within the constructs of the existing budget for your grant program. But certainly, if there's the opportunity to shift funds from one line item to another, we're happy to work with you to make sure that you're keeping your staff and your events safe. With that, I think we can advance to the next slide. So this portion really is all about safety first. In fact, that's going to be our theme running through the webinar for the remaining time we have. As Henry said, adhering to the protocols that have been established by the state of California and the governor is very important. And we've created some protocols that I'll share with you momentarily for our grantees, but we really want to consider ours as the floor, not the ceiling. So we encourage everyone to adhere to the protocols and the requirements that are going to provide the most safety for you, your staff, your volunteers, and your tree planting events. And also, Cindy is going to be talking a little more about integrating liability waivers. I know that was a question that came up in one of the previous polling items that we had a few minutes ago. And then I'm going to share with you a couple of items that are on our website, but we'll walk through them real quick. But let's go back to this idea of adhering to all local, regional, and state requirements, which we're going to touch a bit more on in the next slide, Cindy. Okay, so we have reached out to a lot of other institutions over the course of the last several months to try to maximize information that we can provide to groups, not only regarding tree planting, tree care, but also information for nonprofit organizations and how they can weather the storm that we're currently experiencing. These are resources tying back to what I mentioned regarding local ordinances, county restrictions on what you can and can't do. Many thanks to Local Government Commission to helping us identify these resources. And of course, we can probably list these in the chat as well as on our website. But here's just a quick example of a couple of resources that you can use to help identify what is required or what is the ordinance or local county or government ordinance that is governing what you can and can't do with regard to tree planting events, outdoor activities, and other issues related to your urban forestry project. Next slide, please. So here's one of a couple of resources that we put up on our website to try to help make your event safer for you and your volunteers. This is a modified volunteer sign-in sheet. For those of you that have grants with us, you'll know previously we had a sign-in sheet that had several line items for multiple people to sign in, provide their contact information. I think there were 10 to a page. At this point in time, the idea of handing around a clipboard or a pen to multiple people from different households obviously is less appealing, certainly not as safe. So we've modified this volunteer sign-in sheet as a template. Obviously, you should use this solely as a template, but what we've tried to do here is account for the fact that there may be families that come from the same household that'll be volunteering for your event, but there's going to be a lot of individuals. So this sign-in sheet really encourages one sign-in per individual. Of course, sign-in online is strongly encouraged if your organization has the capacity to be able to do that, but if this is an in-person event, we're really encouraging sign-in sheets that really speak to one person, or if there's additional, they should be really from the same household. This is a template that's available up on our website, along with the next slide, please. So this is sample safety protocols, and I need to give thanks to Amigos de los Rios and Canopy in Palo Alto for allowing us to use their templates to help inform ours. And we've broken it down to 3 categories that hopefully will allow you and your volunteers to, again, maximize opportunities to plant safely, especially with the fall coming up and the likelihood of more tree planting events occurring. So there's safety tips here for registration, site work and preparation pertinent to both staff and volunteers, and then of course the personal protective equipment and social distancing. Again, this is just a template, but if you don't have something in place, you're certainly welcome to utilize this or draw from it. And hopefully this will provide the information necessary for your volunteers to understand what they need to do in order to enjoy a safe and organized experience at your tree planting event. And I think that probably is, I think about one more slide. Okay, so yeah, kind of wanted to end on a high note here. As CAL FIRE said, they do have some funds for urban forestry in this next fiscal year. There's some uncertainty what that actually is going to be in terms of total dollars. We, on the other hand, were fortunate enough to apply for and receive a grant from CAL FIRE in this previous fiscal year that's going to allow us to contribute over $1 million for community grants over the next couple of years. Again, as is always the case with our grant program, it's going to be an emphasis on underserved communities. But what I really want to focus on here in the next minute or so are some of the changes that we're making in response to COVID that we hope are going to help grantees help weather the storm and allow for more robust projects. So one of the things here is you'll see that we're upping our grant maximum from $75,000 to $90,000. We are uncertain how many grants we'll be able to distribute. Of course, it'll also depend on the total number of applications received, but we're still keeping a low bar of 10,000. We know there's a lot of community groups that want to do smaller projects, but for those that want to do larger projects, we wanted to increase that ceiling a bit. Another big change for us here is the personnel cap of 80%. That's a big increase from us. I believe when we first started this program several years ago, we started at 50%. I think since then we've gone up to 60 and maybe even 70 in one category, but 80% of total direct costs, with the emphasis really being on hopefully allowing grantees and applicants to bring match funds to the table that are in the areas of supplies and equipment so they can use more of our dollars for total direct costs and personnel. A slight bump in the cap of indirect from 10 to 12%, consistent with CAL FIRE's grant program. And we hope to roll these out either later this year or the beginning of 2021. So look for that, and we always post this on our website. I believe with that, I'm going to turn this over. I'm sorry, I've got one more slide. Thank you. So we hope everyone stays healthy, safe. I know it's trying times here in California. Cindy is going to talk more about what else we can do to stay safe during these times. And thank you. And over to our Executive Director, Cindy Blaine.
Hi, thank you very much, Chuck. I'm Cindy Blaine, Executive Director with California Relief, and I want to remind everybody, please, to ask questions in the questions box versus the chat box. But thank you so much for being here today to talk about how to make tree planting events as safe as possible for our staff and volunteers. We want to make sure our staff and volunteers are safe, but we also want to make sure that our organizations are safe with respect to liability concerning the spread of COVID through organizational activities. There's been quite a bit of news about this concern, and I hope you've been following it or Googling it. So before we start talking liability, let me be clear. I am not a lawyer, so the suggestions offered here are not legal advice. This portion of our webinar is more of a common sense alert. If you have access to legal counsel, it is always a great idea to consult with them. And before I get into the liability itself, FYI, you may have heard that there was a proposed US Senate bill. It was called the CARES Act 2, which had a COVID protection clause. It was a type of liability shield for businesses and nonprofits to protect them from certain lawsuits related to coronavirus. However, that bill has not been passed, and it does not look like it's going anywhere, according to the Washington Post. So we can't count on that. To stay positive, we have to remember that we have a big advantage as our tree planting activities take place outside. Yay. And there is a lot we can do to make tree planting safe through specific COVID safety protocols, as Chuck just discussed, and you'll hear more of after me. And I want to reiterate, from the perspective of liability, you must follow what the governor is saying, as well as what your local county health department is saying, because those are the law, and you cannot waive the law. So if, for example, the limit is 25 people and you had a waiver, but there were 50 people at your tree planting, then you're in violation, and that's not going to be covered. So as far as the next thing, insurance. As tree planting organizations, you should all have liability insurance. However, your liability insurance does not cover the impacts of disease. I spoke with our relief insurance provider, Cal Nonprofits Insurance Services, and they clarified that liability insurance does not cover claims related to virus and bacteria. There have been literally virus and bacteria exclusions in insurance policies since 2006 in the wake of another virus outbreak, the global SARS outbreak. So at that time, insurance companies developed these virus and bacteria exclusions. So given those exclusions, the truth is anybody can sue you anytime, but if you have a liability waiver that they've signed where it says that they're going to abide by the rules and that they know the risks, then you have a little bit more CYA, as we can put it. So we recommend you include specific liability language regarding COVID infection in a new form or incorporate it into your standard liability waiver and photo permission forms for your volunteers, which all volunteers will fill out, sign and date, as Chuck said, preferably online and before they show up. You want them to know what the rules are before. On our website, and you've already seen the website in the chat box, we provided a couple modified examples from other organizations. So you can have your clear safety guidelines and the liability waiver forms. And this sample waiver forms are thanks to Tree Fresno. We've got Mona talking shortly. Example 1 that we have on our website came from Tree Fresno, and it was modified to get rid of Tree Fresno's name and to get rid of the fairgrounds name, but they did that in conjunction with the fairgrounds. And it's always good to leverage other language that people have put together. So thank you, Mona, for that. That's a 1-pager. Example 2 is a 2-pager from the American Cancer Society that was found online. And we also plan to add other examples as we go along. So check them out, see how they work, talk to your council. Again, like everything with COVID, this is brand new territory and things seem to change daily. So if you have other insights and experiences dealing with COVID liability concerns, we really want to hear about it so we can share with our network and partners. Thank you very much. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mariela because we are going to have time for questions and answers.
Yes, so let's take 4 minutes for questions and answers. I do have some questions lined up. First for CAL FIRE or Chuck, and can we just get the planting done by paying the contractor? So concerns of like having people of the public do tree planting events. So can they pay contractors to complete their projects?
This is Julia. I'm not sure if anybody else was going to jump in. I would say generally yes, but it depends on your project and the scope of it. But for the tree planting itself, that should be possible.
Yeah, and this is Chuck. We concur. I mean, obviously the downside of that is that if it's a smaller grant and you're counting on volunteers to complete the project, then probably involves some changes to your budget to allow for contractors to do that tree planting. However, I did talk to a grantee that said to me that the time that they would be spending as a project manager to organize the volunteer event would be offset by that time going toward contractors and just hiring someone to do that. So it's possible that it would just end up being a wash, but yeah, absolutely. You know, we're allowing for contractors to do that in lieu of a volunteer event, given the circumstances in the state.
Henry, do you have comments?
No, I concur with everything they said. If they were planning on doing the work themselves and now they want to hire a contractor, we can definitely work with you, but we would have to look at your grant and your budget specifically and identify how to do that.
Okay, the next question is on the liability forms. Is the insurance piece relevant just to California or across the states? Cindy?
Hi. As far as just to California or across the US?
Yeah, across the US.
Based on my background, I would say that it should work in other states. But again, this might be something where you want to compare it to the liability forms in your state, even if it's a totally different organization, and check with counsel. You can also talk to your insurance company, but essentially what they told me was that, you know, it's not covered by your insurance and you should be getting a waiver, but they were not providing waiver language.
Okay, we have another question about contractors, but about staff. If budget allows, can staff plant trees in the grant? I believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, this is Henry. That sounds like it's kind of the reverse. Instead of having, maybe they were planning on using only contractors and now they'd like to use some staff time. So it would be the same thing. If you can identify where to get some money or maybe shift it from one line item to the other, then we would be able to most likely do that, most likely through an amendment.
Yeah, and this is Chuck. I concur. We've had a grantee come to us and say that you know, they're in a position where they just have to have the staff do it themselves because of the volunteer events are not conducive to what they can currently perform at this time. But staff can go out and do it and bill either directly to this grant or to other sources that they have in split billing. So completely acceptable.
Okay, we're gonna do one last question. If there's a question I doesn't get answered, I'll email you with the answer. I'll have a list of the questions and answers that were not discussed. So lastly, this is a question for CAL FIRE. Any idea when they expect to know if extensions to the 1718 and the 1819 grants will be allowed?
This is Julia. Not really. I hope it'll be soon. But yeah, I don't know when that will be announced.
Okay, now I'm sorry, Henry, Chuck, did you guys have comments?
No, I don't have any additional comments.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Henry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries.
Yeah, so I know that while CAL FIRE is working internally through the administrative process to try to get extensions, California Relief, when the legislature comes back into session, this is going to be a priority for us. So obviously it'd be fantastic if CAL FIRE and the administration can have extensions in 2020. If not, this will be a priority for us as advocates to work through the legislature to get those extensions through the legislative process, but that doesn't begin until 2021. And if it were to happen through the state budget, then we wouldn't really have an end result till probably June of 2021. So we should all root CAL FIRE on hoping to be able to get this done through administrative process sooner than that.
Okay, now I'm going to go with to Rachel Malloridge, our next speaker. She's the Los Angeles City Forestry Officer. Take it off, Rachel.
Good morning, everyone. Again, Rachel Mallard, City Forest Officer for the City of LA. A little bit about my background. I worked in the nonprofit sector before coming to the city, about 10 years with Tree People, first as a regional manager and then as Director of Forestry, running the planting, tree care, and restoration programs there. And then at Koreatown Youth and Community Center, or KYCC, another tree planting nonprofit in Los Angeles that uses a model. There I was the Assistant Director of Environmental Services, and they use a model that is blended, some volunteer plantings and some crew-based plantings. And I'm really glad to be here this morning and so grateful for Cal Relief once again pulling together resources and opportunities to talk about urban forestry issues impacting all our nonprofits in California. And I'll just share that I too am here as a learner. This is uncharted territory, and I think we're all trying to figure this out, but I'll share a little bit about what we're doing here in LA. Next slide, please. So City Forest Officer, I'll just take a moment and kind of share what this role is. This is a new position that was created in the city about a year ago. My job is to make sure that the 500 square miles and the immense bureaucracy that is the City of LA is acting in a way that residents receive the maximum benefits in terms of public health and quality of life from our urban forest. We don't have an urban forestry management plan, so I'll be working on developing that with our stakeholder groups and departments. But we have a number of different departments that touch trees, and we want to make sure that they're behaving in a coordinated fashion in terms of their urban forestry activities. And so that's my role within the city, is kind of convening and bringing people together and helping lay out that vision and roadmap for our ideal urban forest. And I'll just say that today I'm representing somewhat the City Plants Collaborative. In Los Angeles, we have 7+ nonprofits that do tree planting, and I'll be sharing a little bit about their experiences. And I'm really excited for the Zoom meeting on Friday. I'm hoping that a lot of those partners can attend as they are today and share, directly some of their experiences. Next slide, please. So just a couple key takeaways. As Cindy reached out to me and asked me to share a little bit about, volunteer tree planting in the time of COVID-19, these are some of the things that came to mind for me. We need to be sharing resources. We need to be flexible and nimble. I'm going to recommend that we call things a pilot. We need to continue to connect trees to health and well-being and communicate expectations in a clear fashion. Next slide. So a little bit about the LA scenario. On the left-hand side, we have photos from our Arbor Day event this year. We usually have it around Earth Day. That's when our local officials like to come out and get their picture taken planting trees. This year, because it was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, we decided to bump up the schedule and do it in March. And total coincidence, we planned this back in the fall, but we're able to have our Arbor Day event. And it's a, all of you have stories, I'm sure, of your successful tree planting events and the collaboration of partners, but that's what we have happening here in LA. I won't make you listen to all the happy numbers, but we had a really fantastic event right before the Safer at Home order, and it really just shows the strength of the collaboration between different partners within the city and our nonprofit partners. Next slide, please. So when the Safer at Home order hit, that collaborative, those different nonprofits, City Plants, LACC, KYCC, A Cleaner and Greener East LA, Northeast Trees, Tree People, and LABT, they meet on a regular basis to discuss their DWP contract and best practices and other things like that. And with COVID-19, it was no different. I was involved because the Safer at Home order had very clear instructions about what made someone an essential worker, and that was the first thing we had to clarify was, could our nonprofit organizations that used crews or those wanting to convert staff that normally manage volunteers to planting trees directly, could they do so under the city's Safer at Home order? And the answer was fortunately yes. We were very worried about those young trees out in the field that had direct establishment care that was being provided by our partners, and we were very glad that we were quickly able to make clear that they could continue that work. And what I'm sharing here on this slide are some of the examples that they shared with each other. So those agencies had to shift their staffing practices, they had to implement PPE, just as you all have had to do. And in those monthly meetings, one of the first ones, there was a discussion of, what resources do we have available? On the left-hand side, we have a sign created very quickly by KYCC that they were putting on their trucks to be able to communicate to the public that they were practicing social distancing. And on the right, I have an example here of materials that were found by Los Angeles Conservation Corps as they were getting ready to talk to their staff about spacing in vehicles. And this was part of the materials provided by City of Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety on spacing guidelines for vehicles. So there was this sharing of resources across the entities of how are we talking to staff, how are we training, how are we implementing PPE, how can we be safe? And I think that that is the conversation that we're going to have to continue to have in this time, is talking to each other about best practices, which is obviously why we're here today. And I will also add that I know that some of our organizations are starting to look at doing volunteer events, but it's I don't think that we're actively doing tree planting yet with volunteers, and each of those groups will be responsible for developing their own guidelines for that process. But again, learning from one another. And one of the other things that we talked about early in the Safer at Home order was all it was going to take was one photo of staff standing too close together without masks on for us to potentially have the city shut us down in terms of that essential worker. We were getting lots of tweets and Facebook posts about city staff if they were seen standing too close together, et cetera. And so there is that accountability to each other that we want to be able to continue doing the work. And so we all have to be following those guidelines very carefully. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about being flexible. And I know that you guys already have lots of experience doing that. If you run volunteer events, we have to be nimble and flexible in order to do that work. But I want to talk a little bit about using the term pilot. So I have 3 images on this slide. The one on the top left is from our Arbor Day event. This is a traditional tree adoption, which is when we give 5-gallon trees for people to take and plant at home. They're crowded around the table, they're lining up, they're signing up, they're taking their tree. Well, we knew that based on our contract that the partners really wanted to continue being able to distribute those trees. Again, contract needs, and then also because we were getting interest from the public. People were at home and wanting to do things related to trees. And so City Plants, the leadership there under Rachel Leary, the other Rachel, talked to partners about how we could implement something with COVID-19 to continue getting those trees out to community members and meet that need. And so the picture on the right-hand side of the slide is a screenshot from their Eventbrite page. They decided to try doing virtual adoptions. And so they posted an Eventbrite, people could go on and sign up, and then the partners would go and deliver the trees. It was on the public side very successful. They had 400 slots in that first offering, and it filled up within 24 hours. But what they found out was that it didn't really work well for the partners. It was, again, lots of coordination, lots of listening in developing the program, but it just wasn't working in the way that they had intended, and it wasn't smooth. And instead of, forcing it to continue or, bemoaning all the energy it took to build it, they said, okay, we're going to start over. And I think that's what we're going to continue to be doing in all of our work as we adapt to this time, is needing to say, okay, we're going to test this. It's a pilot. We're going to try it out. And that gives you that room to fail. Like, as part of the growth here is that we need, one, pilots take extra time and bandwidth to build. We're testing, we're tweaking, and we're communicating about our process, but we need to give ourselves that flexibility. And so the bottom picture is of the latest version of tree distributions. And I know that we're not the only ones doing it. I've seen the fun videos from Florida and other places where people are. That is what we found is going to work for the time being, is they said, okay, let's do social distanced scheduled times for people to come and pick up trees at tree adoptions, doing a drive-up model, and that has been really successful. They've distributed over 500 trees over 5 events, and 3 of the 7 partners have been able to host those, and so it's working much better. And so we'll keep improving as we go. Next slide, please. So I want to also say that I think that I will preach to the choir for just a second. This is another great time to be talking to people about the benefits of trees. And I would urge us to continue to make the case for trees as much as we can. Obviously, we've got an illness that affects the respiratory function. We've got wildfires. And people are at home. People are walking in their neighborhoods. And I know that this is what a lot of our partners are seeing, is there's a real interest in trees in a different way. And I think that we should continue to take advantage of that as an opportunity. Next slide, please. In terms of being nimble and flexible, I want to share one other story, and that is, this is quite a long story, so I'll give you the real abbreviated version, and that is that 2 organizations here in the Southern California region had planned large Earth Day, 50th anniversary of Earth Day events for tree distributions to the public, and found themselves with trees that they could not distribute to the public because their events were canceled, and no capacity to pot them up to the next size. And ultimately, they were risking having to throw these seedlings away. And shout out to Cindy Blaine with Cal Relief for connecting University of Redlands, one of those 2 partners, with Rachel O'Leary, who's here on the left, at City Plants. And a huge thanks to LA Conservation Corps and LADWP and all the partners that were involved, our Department of Recreation and Parks. They worked together quickly to develop a plan to take on these seedlings. And I'll just say, from the nonprofit perspective, the number of times that I received offers of tree donations were many, and I always said no, because of concerns with stock and where that tree was going to go, et cetera. I'll just acknowledge that these trees, we knew where they were coming from, we knew the nursery conditions they came from, and they were actually species that we were planning to contract grow. So it really met a need, but it required that nimbleness and flexibility on the part of our partners to accept that donation and essentially start a new project. And I think there's going to be some really exciting outcomes from that over time. We're using it kind of as a bouncing off point. But just another example of we're in a challenging time, and there might be some unique opportunities that we can take advantage of if we have that flexibility. Next slide, please. So again, I'll go kind of back to this thought as we looking at sharing resources, looking at being flexible, using the term of pilot, connecting people to that understanding that trees are good for our communities. I'll just offer a couple, for lack of a better term, armchair observations as we start to think about volunteers. Again, I'm not managing an organization that's deploying volunteers at this point in time, but I want to just offer that we know that volunteers do really well with clear expectations and instructions. And so we now have a whole other realm of information that we'll be providing to them in terms of the type of PPE and the type of protocols we'll be using at our events. And I think it's important, and I think the 2 organizations coming next will share a little bit about what they've learned and what's working for them. But I would say, as you can think about having volunteer events, think about who is going to be the enforcer of these coronavirus-related guidelines and how they're going to do that. I think that that's really important because it's an extra role really at the event, making sure that we're maintaining these safe distances, that we're doing masks or whatever the guidance is from our city, state, county agencies, because again, we want to keep people safe, and we want to be able to continue to do this work if it is safe to do volunteer events. So communicating those expectations and making a plan for implementing them is obviously why you all are here today, I think. And I want to offer one other suggestion, which is we've seen this real shift to familiarity with the online platforms like GoToWebinar, like Zoom. And I would offer that you could consider how to use that kind of new normal of online meetings to maybe do some pre-event meetings, maybe a Zoom call where you talk about the COVID-19 guidelines and the expectations for the event, maybe do some of your icebreakers there, just as a thought of something that you might want to try as we get ready to engage volunteers in tree planting, offering different ways for them to engage and continuing to be nimble and flexible. So with that, good luck to all of you as you think about re-engaging volunteers. And I do hope that you give yourself some time to feel the sadness. I know that this spring was really hard. April was going to be a very busy month here. We're going to plant a lot of trees, and it's sad not to be able to run roll out our great programs. So I hope you give yourself a moment to think about the great work you usually do and feel that moment of sadness that we can't do it in the way we normally do, and then embrace the opportunity to continue to meet the needs of the public. And thanks for all the work you do. I'm gonna, with that, I'll pass it off to Mona from Trees Fresno.
Hello, thank you, Rachel. I appreciate that. That's a lot of great information, and I appreciate the tips. So first of all, thank you for giving Tree Fresno the opportunity to present a snapshot of our work, which is focused on tree planting throughout the San Joaquin Valley, including the counties of Fresno, Madera, Kings, and Tulare. Specifically, I'm going to share with you how we promote, including awareness and engagement, and also how we work with willing and resourceful partners for plantings and planning ahead for trees. Finally, I want to touch upon some tips that we've adopted and learned along the way regarding what we call controlled volunteer plantings. Next slide. I'm Mona Nyandoro Cummings, and I became CEO of the community benefit organization Tree Fresno nearly 1 year ago. The mission of Tree Fresno is to transform the San Joaquin Valley with trees, greenways, and beautiful landscapes. Our organization began in 1985 with a small group of concerned citizens, which concluded that trees are the perfect solution to so many of our societal ills. Since then, we planted nearly 50,000 trees. Next slide. Over the past 4 years, Tree Fresno has received a majority of its funding from California's Climate Change Initiative via the High-Speed Rail Authority and as part of urban and community forestry grants managed by CAL FIRE. So when this funding is fully utilized, we will have planted nearly 7,000 trees on school campuses, in parks, churches, and along streets in urban areas, which presently exhibit a lack of tree coverage. Next slide. Tree Fresno also receives funding through the California Air Resources Board from an approved supplemental environmental project, which allows community-based projects to be funded from a portion of penalties received during settlement enforcement actions. So Tree Fresno's SEP evaluates how well vegetative barriers using trees and shrubs protect people from exposure to air pollution downwinds of major roads. Tree Fresno also understands that increased public awareness enables us to achieve our mission. As part of our grants, we are required to engage the community in our planting activities. As you can see here, recently we partnered with Outfront Media, which resulted in 30 billboards like these across the city of Fresno. Next slide. I would like to point out that we had initially expected to prompt people to volunteer more for our activities until COVID interfered, and we changed the call to action, as you can see on these billboards, for the general public to donate today instead. So next slide. Let us reminisce. This is a planting which was held in Fresno on Leap Day of this year, February 29th, just before COVID hit us. Though we aren't currently trumpeting the call to volunteer, we regularly receive inquiries from those who want to come and plant. People are motivated. Next slide. To keep our volunteers, back one please. To keep our volunteers engaged, I add their contact information to our database and explain to them that when the time comes for tree plantings, they'll be invited to join us. In the meanwhile, we make sure to share our newsletter and invite them to follow our activities on social media, where they are also encouraged to donate. Donations are a way that people can help us accomplish our tree planting goals. And as a person who has over a dozen years of fundraising experience, I urge you to ask others for support. It's an honor to be asked, and right now, since many people can't volunteer, it is an avenue for engagement. Next slide. Tree Fresno has lots of partners, including cities, counties, public agencies, school districts, nonprofits, even the private industry. We partner to support the planting of trees, the installation of irrigation, and to ensure a reliable source of water. It's during these times that relationships have proven to be the most important. When there is reduced staffing like what we're experiencing during COVID and a focus, attention on COVID, it's Tree Fresno's goal to remind our partners to think about the benefits of trees and to keep their eyes on a post-COVID environment. Next slide. In mid-March, Tree Fresno reached out to all San Joaquin Valley cities, counties, and school districts to offer them free trees, especially through our CAL FIRE grants. Our message to them was, now is the time to plant trees when there's less foot traffic on campuses and public spaces. Trees also symbolize an investment into the future. They symbolize hope. Next page. Since that period of time, we've been working on follow-up calls and emails. Each communication is different. Some are ready to work with us and finding locations to plant now, and some are creating future planting plans. A takeaway from this experience for Tree Fresno is that every year we will reach out to every one of our potential partners so that we can determine their need for tree planting, provide plans, and offer general support. Next slide. Now, regarding the important task of volunteerism in the time of COVID, before our hot summer began, Tree Fresno started implementing a COVID-friendly model of volunteerism. We were first identified as essential by the city of Fresno. We made sure that we covered that base. In this case, you see a planting crew, which we hosted at our local county fairgrounds. The fairgrounds developed a COVID-specific waiver, and we took on the responsibility of strategic recruitment of families and housemates and workplace teams. Next slide. You saw a snapshot of this earlier in one of the presentations, which is the waiver that actually the fair created for our particular event. Let me tell you about this pilot event. Held at the fair on Arbor Day, Tree Fresno hosted a controlled planting of about 75 trees. We did not open the event up to the public, and we only reported on the activities on social media post-event. Next slide. I recruited family members along with 2 of my tree care techs, the office manager, a lead volunteer, an individual who contacted me from Fresno State for community service hours, and 3 people from a local triathlon club. All volunteers signed waivers and worked in familiar groups, utilizing social distancing and masks. And I mentioned this as a pilot because we were desperate. We had to get these trees in the ground, and that's what we did to organize our first group of volunteers. Next slide. Tree Fresno provided each person with a shovel to use for the event, and every individual brought their own personal items like sunblock, masks, hats, water bottles, etc. We or they wiped down and sanitized the equipment upon return, and 2 fair employees, our hosts for the planting, buzzed around on their golf carts, providing any support needed. Next slide. In reality, as tree planters, we should feel privileged that much of our work is done outside, where we can apply safety measures to continue making progress towards improving air quality and reducing greenhouse gases, etc. In fact, in an effort to go with the flow, we recently ordered face masks, which we can use with our volunteers and staff, but also in our donation program. Next slide. In conclusion, Tree Fresno believes in the mission of our work, which is to expand the urban tree canopy throughout the San Joaquin Valley. We plant trees. It is during this desperate time where our community is experiencing the devastation of COVID and the repercussions of uncontrolled wildfire, where our organization can provide hope for the future. This is our opportunity to bring others along with us on this journey. And I'll reiterate what Rachel said before, now is the best time for trees, for both community health and the prevention of climate change. Next slide. And we invite you to keep up with our work on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're treefresno.org. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Elise now.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Canopy participated in the Cal Relief Learn Over Lunch the other month, and it's really great to be back with you all. Thank you for inviting me. So next slide, please. My name's Elise Willis. I've been at Canopy for about 5 years now, and I stepped into the Tree Programs Director role at the beginning of this year. There's me selfieing with a Valley Oak, which is how you'll normally find me. Our mission at Canopy is to grow urban tree canopy in the Mid-Peninsula communities for the benefit of all. We've been around for about 25 years, and we serve several communities in the San Mateo and Santa Clara counties here in the Bay Area, namely Palo Alto, East Palo Alto, Mountain View, and Menlo Park. Those are main areas right now. And I wanted to just share, we have a fairly small staff of 9, soon to be 12. We're a little understaffed the last few months, and so we're excited to be hiring some new people on right now. And we have 13 teen urban foresters who are paid high school interns from East Palo Alto. Next slide. So we have been working very hard, just like many of you, for the last few months. And our main ways that we accomplish our goals are through tree planting and tree care, which I'm going to talk about, through education for youth and adults, and advocacy, which was really important when we were trying to salvage our funding through city budget cuts and foundations having all the struggles earlier this year. So I'm going to talk mostly about trees, our tree stuff, and I want to touch on some education stuff we've been doing as well. Next slide. So I wanted to point out we have some staff who's been doing some really cool stuff with K through 12 education, and we pivoted a lot of stuff to distance learning. So we've got lots of stuff online that's available for everyone, really great lessons and things for lots of different age groups, and video instruction, which is things that we didn't have before. So one thing is we've had to stretch and grow in this area, and we've reached a bigger audience because of it. So I encourage y'all, if you're interested, to check out via the link right there. Next slide. I mentioned our Teen Urban Foresters. This is arguably one of our most impactful and awesome programs we have. And we really love being able to work with them in the field. Our high school interns had to pivot to online stuff, just like lots of folks did. And so they work on projects such as a Green Gap research project that they were doing, and working on trying to plan for planting trees at a preschool. And we pushed all of that online, and it's been largely very successful working with them. And basically the fieldwork component had to be put on pause. We did try to work with them a little bit, but it was just too much for us. And there were just too many barriers over the summertime to do much fieldwork with them, which we had to accept. And luckily we had these other great things we were able to do with them. Next slide. Adult ed also had a pivot, but in a good way. We normally will do tree talks and events in public with people in person, and instead we launched our More Trees Please webinar series, which is the first webinar series we've ever done, and it's been really successful. We had the first one in July and then in August, and each one had 200 to 300 people on the line, and it was really cool. You can check that out more if you're interested on this link. And we have Community Forestry School, which is an 8-week course we do in September and October, where we invite the public to learn all kinds of cool urban forestry stuff, and we engage them in field work and hopefully get them to be regular volunteers with us after they've participated. And so we've moved this all online to Zoom as well, and that's just kicked off recently and seems to be going pretty well. And so just want to encourage you all that this is something that you can do. Next slide, please. Last thing on adult ed, we have tree walks that we normally do every month with an arborist in a neighborhood, and those are really great, and people learn about trees and enjoy time outside. And we did try earlier in the year to do Facebook Live, and that did not seem to be as great as we would have wanted. And so our staff took videos of arborists doing these walks and put them online on our web page, and that's been really great. It adds it makes it kind of a longer shelf life as well. And wanted to just give you all a sneak peek. On the left is a little snapshot of us. We had an intern working this summer to start using ArcGIS story maps so that we can have our tree walks be even more mobile friendly. And this is not even open to anybody yet, but it looks really good. And I think if anyone has questions about this, I'm happy to point you to the information on this. It's really great, especially for getting people outside, which is tough at the moment because of smoky conditions, but when weather is better, that'll be great. Next slide. Okay, let's give you guys what you came for. We had to shelter in place middle of March, and we didn't have our first volunteer activity with volunteers until June 25th. So what did we do in that time? Our program staff had a bunch of trees we had to try to keep alive that we had planned to plant in the spring, and we've just been trying to keep them alive all summer in pots. And while we were, sheltering in place at home, working from home, we had very minimal staff out in the field just doing the bare bones stuff that we needed to keep some of our inventory alive and working. And so in that time, we were developing safety documents. The volunteer checklist and the canopy staff checklist you see here are pages 2 and 3 of our field safety guidelines for volunteers. I'm happy to share this with whoever wants it. It goes through, if you look at the volunteer checklist, basics of what we expect of people before they volunteer with us. And so we plan in our future volunteer activities to be sharing this with anyone who's going to plan to come out with us. And so when they sign our waiver online, they're also reading our checklist and reading our safety guidelines. So this includes doing self-assessments for their own health and comfort level, registering for volunteerships online ahead of time, so no walk-ups, and it's touch-free. We also are doing temperature checks and encouraging people to take their own transportation and requiring social distancing, face coverings, and gloves. And then a couple other basic things are mentioned here. And then we have a longer document that's used internally for staff as far as the exact how-tos that our county has put together for if someone gets COVID and things like that. Next slide. So our pilot tree care workday with the city of Mountain View at the end of June went well. It was our first time making an effort, and everyone there looks like they're having a pretty good time. We pruned and weeded and staked some trees. Our biggest question we had going into that day was, can we share tools? And wearing masks and wearing gloves and doing those other precautions, we decided to give people their own tools to use. So the city provided some additional materials so we could do that. And then afterward, we felt that, and many of the volunteers provided feedback that they felt that most people felt comfortable wearing gloves and sharing tools. And then anyone who's not comfortable can have their own set. We have to keep our gatherings under 25 people. And so, and this can change obviously over time, but this is what it's been like here for a while. And so we had 2 shifts for people to sign up for online so we could keep our numbers low. And it also made it for an even better experience so that as one of the city arborists there on the far left was giving instruction on how to prune for new people, it was actually very interactive. And I want to mention that we believe social distance activities of them, the best is going to be mulching and weeding events. And so we're going to save this for general volunteers if we have any of those days, and for if we have larger groups or larger sites. Next slide. We also tend to survey trees a lot in the summer and somewhat throughout the year. The Young Tree Care Survey is our annual summer survey of street trees throughout Palo Alto. And I had an intern and I have small groups of volunteers out doing surveys of trees. And this was a nice activity for social distancing because you can do this in small groups and you can do it when the weather's good, and you can do it with with one partner, staying 6 feet apart. And then I want to mention, I can show you a photo on the right from the Great Oak Count. We had a little training, and one of our experienced volunteers is showing off an oak to these new volunteers, and they're all standing 6 feet apart or more and all wearing masks, and it went pretty well. Next slide. We also did a tree planting, and we normally don't want to do this in August because of the plant, that's technically out of the planting season, but we are part of this effort at this new community center. And so you can see on the left, folks are planting some 15 gallons, volunteers, and they're doing this spread apart with masks and gloves. And luckily they're shorter trees. So that part went really smoothly. And you can see on the right, two girls who are sisters who live in the same household are working a bit closer together on a 24-inch box tree. They got a little extra help later on. But this works pretty well. I will mention that all of these folks are teen urban foresters and experienced planting leaders. So this worked well for our pilot because we didn't have to give lots of planting instruction, and it was a lot easier to coordinate this way. And then I'll mention that the 6-foot distance was the hardest when we were planting 24-inch boxes. And in the future, we'll have to work out more of the details on how to do this safely as we're staking trees, because the majority of the trees that we are funded to plant are 15-gallon size. And so they usually require some kind of staking. Next slide. So at check-in, we take people's temperature with the forehead thermometer I took a snapshot of on the right, and that worked pretty well to be able to point that at someone's forehead and get their temperature and clear them for the day. On the left, you can see the digital thermometers we got for all of the staff and teen urban foresters to use before they leave for a work day. That way, they're not showing up for work with a high temperature. And so we also provided at our events hand sanitizer, a water jug for refilling your water bottle, and it was quite hot. So our planting manager provided some popsicles. There's also extra gloves and masks upon request. Next slide. All right, so I took a snapshot on the right of the air quality from Purple Air of our area on Friday. As you can see, it was very poor. As we have lots of environmental setbacks likely to occur throughout this fire season, we have to establish other guidelines too, I think, that kind of go along with all of this other stuff. So I took a snapshot on the left of some of our in-progress guidelines for our staff to follow. We are still needing to discuss this more as time goes on, but generally putting something like this together, this was helpful for us, especially because we're working with our teenage interns, and there's a lot of responsibility with that in particular, and a lot of planning and staff involvement. And so having some clear guidelines for our staff on when you can go out and do field work and when you should have an N95 and all these things is going to be important, and we're going to have to be flexible. So wanted to bring this up as well because it's an important thing, as we've had a spare the air alert in the Bay Area for a month now. Next slide, please. Almost done. So for tree planting in the future, we're going to not have events like this in this photo. This was a past planting. This is what a normal MLK Day planting or something would look like. And we're going to have to just bring these down a lot in scale and make sure this will probably lead to having events that have a longer day as we work in shifts, which is very possible and might be beneficial in many ways. And then we plan to work with select community partners and volunteer groups in inviting specific folks. We think that this really will help in a lot of ways, and relying, like I said, throughout the year on our planting leaders, our Tufts, students that go through community forestry school, and other regulars. And we are planning to do Zoom trainings for new volunteers, and we are looking forward to testing that out as well. Until we return to safer circumstances, of course. Hopefully one of these days we'll get back to stuff like this photo. Next slide. So for all of these plans, really the reasoning behind this is that having consistency and familiarity with our volunteers, and like I said, engaging specific groups regularly. We hope this will be safer so that everyone knows our COVID expectations. We feel this to be easier to coordinate rather than our larger general volunteer days that we used to have frequently. We think that this will give us more better quality plantings with less staff oversight. And then, we think on the day of, this will be more efficient. And our safety guide on the right, we're going to have to, as Rachel was sharing, put together more, more signage and more information for folks who are out and about, making sure that anything we're doing in the public eye and with volunteers has signage and all the expectations are clear, and we can be above board, so to speak. So we'll have to add to our safety guide or make some more fun doodles. Next slide. All right, that's it. Cool, I think I'm on time. Thanks everyone so much. And back to Mariella.
Thank you, Lise. That was great. And it was awesome that you included the stuff about wildfires and air quality. So thank you so much. I can see some stuff coming in. So let's see, hopefully I can get through everything. There is a question for Rachel. Rachel, where's that question? Oh, here it is. Does the City of LA consider street trees planting and/or care an essential service? Is there city guidance on the number of volunteers allowed at an event? So Rachel, can you answer that?
For City of LA, I have to say off the top of my head, I'm not sure. Again, we aren't at a point where we're encouraging volunteer events necessarily, so I'm not off the top of my head, no.
Okay. This one's for Canopy. Can you explain how exactly Canopy is implementing touch-free events sign-in?
Sure. So on our website, we have a calendar that we post our events, and normally people would click on the event they want to sign up for, and they would see our waiver, and they would sign it digitally and fill out their information and submit it, and they'd be signed up for an event. And then when you show up at the event, we'd have someone on staff who's managing our check-in table, and if you had signed up ahead of time, before we closed online registration, you would be on a printout of all the attendees who signed up. And so they would just ask you your name and check you off the list. And then we would also normally have walk-ups allowed. And so then anyone who didn't sign up ahead of time would be allowed to fill out a waiver on paper and turn that in and participate. And so, like I said, we would be eliminating the walk-ups, and we would just be requiring the online signups as the touch-free option.
Okay, I have another question about for Elise. Has anyone considered doing a smell test in addition or in place of a temperature check?
A smell test?
Yeah, you know how some people who have COVID aren't able to smell or taste instead of in case because they have COVID, so in lieu of the temperature.
That's a very interesting question. I have not considered that. I feel like at this point, temperature would be our main thing. And if anybody's been to the dentist or eye doctor or anything lately, they do a temperature check, and they put the little thing on your finger to take your blood oxygen level, which is another sign. And so if we were to add additional precautions, I feel like I'd probably lean more on getting a device to test people's blood oxygen level, which I think would probably be a bit more reliable than like a scratch and sniff option, if you will.
Okay. Another question for you, Lise. Can you share the Zoom training? That would be really helpful in terms of like what you're saying to the volunteers and all of that information you're sharing with them before the event.
Sure. Yeah, we still have to work out some of the details of this. There might be like a pre-recorded video we might put together with some of the basics. And then once we host the Zoom sessions, going over everything, we could probably record at least one of them. And so we'll find a way. We're going to also have a page on our website dedicated to COVID related changes that we're making. And so Ideally, once we do this, we would have some kind of video representation of things on there too. So we'll make sure to share out with Cal Relief when we've got some of that stuff up.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is for Mona. Mona, you touched a little bit about schools, and how was the response from the schools in terms of like talking to them about potentially doing tree planting right now that school is closed?
So we've contacted probably 20 different school districts and had some responses. At the beginning, they weren't quite sure what to do. We do have, as I mentioned, a CARB project, which is a SEP program to where we're building vegetative barriers. And we actually did one planting where we used a contractor to implement that project. They are receptive to plantings on campuses, whether we are conducting them or their employees are conducting them. So I think they're very careful not to, we're not doing volunteer plantings on those particular facilities, but we have actually that call out to school districts and schools. We have had quite a bit of feedback and requests for especially replacement trees. So our CAL FIRE grant will provide for replacement trees where we actually know the locations of those campuses and where they're going to be planted. So we have had actually quite a bit of success with convincing school districts that now is the time to replace those trees with the limited staffing that they have.
That sounds great. And then let's see.
I want to add one more thing, is that small towns are easier to work with, small cities, as opposed to the larger cities and school districts. I find that small towns and small school districts are more receptive and willing to accommodate this request at this time.
And then you talked about replacing wells that are empty, or like replacement trees that are dead. Did you have any challenges in terms of like doing a bigger project right now with a particular school now that there are no students and tree care would be a little bit easier?
It depends on the school district. We always have to work directly with the school district to get approval for planting on any campuses. So it's a matter of, we work with a landscape architect to create a plan and negotiate that with the school district. And personally, I think that they're open to plantings right now, as long as they're safely implemented and they can provide the partnering resources in terms of irrigation and possible labor to put in trees that we need for that. So I know it's not specific, but it's with each school district, it's going to be different, and we negotiate. Sometimes we will have the resources to offer irrigation, and sometimes we don't, and they need to offer the irrigation, and we offer the free trees, and we use our limited staffing and maybe those controlled volunteer activities, meaning, maybe we'd have 5 or 6 volunteers to be able to help us put in those trees at that particular time.
Okay, let me just move on to another question for Elise. Could you please give the text link to the thermostat that you are using, and then and the air quality report site. So that was Purple Air. Thanks for pointing that out. I will include that on our COVID page, the link to Purple Air, so that people are able to take that into consideration as they're also planning their tree planting events. But yeah, Elise, can you probably drop in the chat the link to the URL for the thermostat that you're using?
Sure, I can track that down. And there are a lot of them available now beyond the ones we got. We got 2, by the way, so that we could have, if we're having a couple of simultaneous events, which we are usually not doing more than 2 at the same time, which goes to show how small we are, kind of. Some of you are probably thinking that's crazy. We just got 2, but I would recommend getting as many as you would need for however many simultaneous events you have. But yeah, I'll drop that in.
We have a question on thoughts on sanitizing tools effectively, sorry. I think that's a question for Elise again, sorry.
Oh, well, maybe Mona can speak to how you all did it. So for us, in our field safety guidelines, we say that we will sanitize them or leave them for 4+ days per protocols. And so if more information comes out, we'll change that. You haven't all seen, but it is dated, the field safety guidelines for volunteers, so that if we need to update it, we can update it and change the date and be using a new version. But for now, for us, I don't think that tool cleaning is super efficient, but that's something we actually need to work out a bit more lately because our operations have been pretty small. We have not had to sanitize a whole lot of different stuff. I don't know if Mona has anything to add.
That's the same for me. We haven't run into that issue yet. We just sanitized on the spot. So it's, I think it'll depend on how those regulations change.
And then for you, Mona, again, and Elise again, what website or software are you using for the online waiver?
So we're not really using a software. Typically we would embed the text into our web page, into our online calendar on our web page, which we have. Ours is a, oh, why am I blanking on this? Basically we just put it on our website. Yeah.
And Mona, do you want to say something on how you guys got your volunteers? Was there anything that you had to do online or some sort of training?
We did not, but I haven't, we actually haven't orchestrated too many volunteer events after summer. So ours at the beginning, we were actually having them sign the waivers individually. And then we recruited them strategically, as I mentioned in the presentation, so that we would know that they were from specific households. So again, as Rachel mentioned earlier, it was a pilot. And so now we have a little bit more structure to go with.
Okay, the next question is for Mona. Who in the school districts do you get in touch with in order to plan for tree planting events in school? Is it always via the landscape architect?
So the landscape architect is separate. So that person actually does assignments, contracts with Tree Fresno for our various projects. So we do work typically with the operations and maintenance manager of the school district. For instance, Fresno Unified is a school district of 75 to 80,000 students. So we are directed to go through that particular department. And I'm assigned someone to work with to see what are the possibilities of being able to plant and maintain trees. Now with the smaller school districts, I usually go directly to the superintendent, associate superintendent, and sometimes maintenance and operations. But in reality, those smaller school districts, I think you have to attack it from the very top.
Okay, one more question. I just received an email from the company Planet Geo, who has just completed the tree planting survey for Fremont. They are asking to meet with TUFA to collaborate with the process. Does anyone have experience with this? I'm wondering what they would like us to do. Has anyone have experience with Planet Geo?
I know Planet Geo because we have Tree Plotter. I'm assuming it's Lynn asking that question. Not positive, but whoever it is can reach out to me. I'm not sure that I can answer your question, but I know them.
Okay.
They also have, this is Mona from Fresno, and we also use Tree Plotter, and they are also trying to work with the city of Fresno to develop that urban forestry management plan. And I've seen some examples of their work, and they're quite good, and they have that readily available to look at. So I would probably work with them again.
I just want to go back to CAL FIRE. There's two questions that we still have a little bit of time or not. Just two questions to CAL FIRE. At volunteer events, how do you balance social distancing requirements with the potential for increased tree mortality from inexperienced volunteers planting increasingly?
That is a good question. I don't know how I would tackle that. COVID safety is top priority. You know, I would say you can hopefully do online trainings or anything else to educate people enough to not end up with poor plantings and associated mortality, if that's what somebody is asking.
Rachel, do you want to touch on this, or Elise or Mona?
I think I'll just say the examples provided by Elise and Mona are, I think, really fantastic in terms of talking about how we safety related to the virus is number one. And then obviously we want to run really great volunteer events where people have support to do the work properly, and how you go about doing that, I think, is going to be on an organization by organization basis, and again, may require some trial and error.
Elise, do you want to touch on this? I know you talked about selecting volunteers that have planted in the past with you guys and are able to our experience in terms of tree planting.
Yeah, sorry, what was the specific part of the question you wanted me to answer?
Just the balancing tree volunteer events during COVID and not increasing tree mortality. So like having to train during a tree planting event right now during COVID, inexperienced volunteers on how to properly plant a tree.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, one thing I didn't mention is that we do these things called popcorn plantings. I think some groups call them single increment plantings, where we'll do site visits and plan to plant 1 or 2 trees at a residential property, like on private property. And we have a number of trees that are in this category. And so we're planning, we believe there will be a number of people who want to volunteer with us that we can train to plant. And it could do this pretty effectively, given the tools and a bit of training initially, and then they'll hopefully know what to do and be able to move forward doing that throughout the season, you know, repeatedly working with us. But for now, really relying on the folks who do know how to plant with us. And then we have how to plant a tree videos in English and Spanish on our website, and then just supplementing those with other specific trainings online, and then maybe even small group trainings in the field for folks who are gonna, like I said, keep coming back, rather than, okay, you learned how to plant a 15-gallon tree with us once and then we never see you again. We hope that we can get people who can really commit and be regulars with us, and we hope that that will increase our, you know, or reduce any risk of tree mortality.
Okay, one last question and then final thoughts, and then we'll be done. Are volunteers required to sign in at events, or can staff check a box indicating that the volunteer is present and in order to maintain physical distancing? I think this question, it was during the CAL FIRE and California Relief session. So do you guys want to touch on this? I believe this is probably a requirement if you have a grant with California Relief or CAL FIRE. Chuck?
Thanks, Mariella. Yeah, that is a tough question. I think probably for purposes of being able to identify whether or not the volunteer is acknowledging that there's safety protocols in place, it is better to have that sign in, whether it's online or in person. If you go back to the volunteer form, or you go online, you can see the volunteer form that we created. You'll see that we created actually a little square there that has some text that talks about that by signing in, by volunteering, you're acknowledging that you're going to adhere to the safety protocols established by the organizer. So if someone is checking them in, I guess there's that uncertainty as to whether or not they're signing off on following the safety protocols. And of course, as Cindy discussed, the liability waivers are an additional safeguard that the organizing or the organizer can take. So I think for purposes of our grants, we're going to ask that folks do sign in online, preferable, but in person, but having that disclaimer on there that they're acknowledging that there's safety protocols in place and that they're going to follow them.
And if I can add, this is Rachel, I would say that this is also a question for you, maybe with your insurance provider. I think that that is another component, and why in the past we've had, in the organizations I work for, had volunteers sign in, as it was, again, part of this like protection of liability. And I think that's a really personal decision on the part of the organization, and should probably talk to your human resources or insurance component.
And this is Julian. Just to add to that, I like the disclaimer, I like the waiver, I like giving information up front about the expectation. But I think when it comes down to it, there's still a discrepancy between acknowledging how important safety precautions are and actually following it. So if it were my event, if I see somebody, despite everything, not following it, I would have no problem sending them home. And if they have a concern in any way, they're all welcome to reach out to us as regional urban foresters. And we are happy to share, the governor's intent and our intent when it comes to COVID safety.
Yes, that's very helpful, Julia. Making sure that all your volunteers are properly distanced, wearing a mask, and during those tree planting events. Does anyone have any final thoughts or last comment from the speakers? Okay, sounds good. So just to let everyone know, this was recorded. You're going to get a link to, in order for you to rewatch it. All of the resources are on our COVID page. I'll update it with some of the resources provided by some of the speakers here. And you'll receive a URL for that too. Thank you everyone for taking the time, and I know we're over 7 minutes, so thanks everyone who stayed on. That's it. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.